The King's Indian Defense is one of the most versatile openings in chess. It can be used against a variety of setups and is good against them all. It is a favorite of Hikaru Nakamura and of Garry Kasparov. In this video, I will show you how to play the King's Indian Defense. Make sure to stay tuned because at the end I'll break down Hikaru's most famous win with the King's Indian. Alright everybody, now before we get into any specific opening lines or anything like that in the King's Indian, let's get started and explain what this setup based opening is. Now the King's Indian Defense can be played against any opening except for e4. When you play against e4, it's called something a little bit different and it's a bit different of an opening. So what we're talking about is d4, c4, and knight f3 on the first move. And against any of those moves, you can play the King's Indian Defense. So let's start with d4. This is the most traditional move of those three. And on the first move, you're going to play knight to f6. Now, this is called the Indian game. This is partially where the King's Indian gets its name from. And the traditional way that white will continue is c4. Now here, if you're a King's Indian player, you have one move to make, and that move is g6. So you get d4, knight f6, c4, and g6. And now your opponent, to continue down the main line, will either go for knight to f3, or they'll go for knight to c3. Let's say knight to c3. And here you can play the King's Indian Defense by fianchettoing your bishop to g7. And so here, bishop g7, this is the King's Indian Defense. Now, what are the characteristics of the King's Indian Defense? Well, first of all, you are going to have this fianchettoed bishop along the long diagonal, and it is going to be a strong piece with a lot of potential energy. And what is potential energy? Well, this piece isn't going to be great immediately, but what it does do is it applies pressure directly or indirectly to this pawn in the center, and that's going to be a strategy, is you're going to want to attack their center. You're also going to want to create a pawn storm on the king side. But we'll get to that in a second. Alright, and the typical way your opponent can continue is by playing e4 here. And here, before you castle, you want to play d6, so your opponent cannot play e5. And here your opponent may play a few different moves. One option they have is knight to f3 and castles. And this is how a lot of King's Indian defenses go. They are slow maneuvering openings that end up exploding in tactics later in the game, and I'll show you how that goes. So this is the basic setup for the King's Indian, and this is the setup you're going to see in a lot of positions. You get this pawn structure where you've got a pawn on d6, a pawn on g6, and these are sort of protecting some key squares in your position. You've also got the fianchettoed bishop, your knight on f6, and you're always going to castle kingside in the King's Indian. There are maybe one or two lines where you could go queenside, but very rarely are you going to go kingside or go queenside, because you have the advantage on the king side, and that's what you're going to play for. You don't want to go to the queen side because your opponent can open up files very easily, and that's where they're going to try to play. Now let's talk about more specifically the kind of plans that opponents have in these positions. One major plan for black and white is, first of all, black is going to want to play this move e5 or this move c5 in a lot of positions. Black wants to break in the center and create a pawn storm on the king side. So black is going to follow e5 with f5 and f4 and g5, g4, g3. Like, black is going to send all their pawns down the board, trying to checkmate the white king, which is also likely to go kingside in a lot of these positions. Now, what is white planning to do? Well, white has this large advancement of pawns that they can play for on the queen side, and white is going to try to play for the queen side and gain tons of space over here, from which white can set their pieces up strongly. The knight can find a nice outpost on c5 sometimes, and also this pawn might get sent down. So basically, white's going to attack with their pawns on the queen side, black's going to attack on the king side, and there's a few different advantages and disadvantages. One thing I like for black is the threat is very simple. Black is going to run all their pawns down the king side, gain tons of space, and black is going to be able to attack the white king very easily once this plan is completed. White, on the other hand, is going to attack on the queen side, from which white can invade black's position and start winning some material and get control over the board. Usually through the invasion of the c file here. There's going to be a rook likely going to the c file. Queen may invade the c file. So there's all sorts of ways that white can invade through the queen side and win material, and from there win the game. So when you're playing black, you do have a much better, not better, but simpler way of playing. Alright, I'm about to show you one of the most common tactical ideas that makes the King's Indian defense work. Now, first thing you need to know about the King's Indian is that this bishop is very strong, and its influence pervades even when it's being blocked by the knight. So in this position, it doesn't look possible because of the knight and this pawn, but e5 is actually a possible, and it is the best move in this position. Why is it the best move? Well, if white takes, you just take back with the pawn. And let's just say white exchanges queens. You get your rook to the center. And now, white decides to capture the pawn. Now this pawn that looks like it was hanging and looks like white has won a pawn is actually just simplifying the position, which I'd say is in black's favor here. You can play the nice move, knight takes e4, which is great because you're giving up your knight, but getting a knight right back, and you're winning a pawn. And you're revealing the bishop's control over e5. So you get this position that looks like this. And this is a position I kind of like for black. First of all, black's got this nice rook controlling the file already. Black's development is going to be very simple. It's going to involve bishop to f5, knight to c6, and you're going to have some strong development. Not to mention that your rook may invade and your other rook may come to d8. And your king already has a left square. And you're going to be in great shape here. So the engine says it's slightly better for black, but this position practically is much easier to play for black because black's winning tempo, and also white hasn't castled yet. White's going to have to take a turn to castle, and white has to play precisely to maintain equality. Alright, so now that you've seen what happens when the opponent takes, a lot of time they won't take, so they're going to castle, and you play knight to c6. Now, knight c6 is one of the common moves here, and what happens is you get a King's Indian style structure after your opponent plays this move d5. Now, d5 is a very important move in this position. It releases the tension of the pawns in the center here, and it really closes up the structure. It's really important that white plays this move at some point because it's gaining space, gaining control, and it's also making the c5 break a lot stronger for them. So after they're going to play d5, they're going to start running their pawns up the board and playing for the c5 break for sure. So after knight to c6, you're going to go knight to e7. Nice, creating pressure on the center here. And one of the most common moves here is b4. And this is called the bayonet attack for white. Bayonet attack against the King's Indian defense. And as you can see here, the engine really likes this for the white side. But that's kind of the one thing about the King's Indian defense. When you look at it through the engine always loves white in these positions. They love the space that white gets on the queen side. They love the attack that white's going to get by playing c5 and putting their bishop on a3 and sliding their rook over, playing down the c file. But when black starts getting their pawns rolling, it really starts becoming a bit of a interesting game. You know, knight h5, let me go c5, and then knight f4, a4, c6. There's like all sorts of strategy in these kind of positions, and as you go on and on, engine likes white less and less, and eventually you can get to a position where engine just thinks that white's getting checkmated on the king side, especially after, let's say, we play f5, And opponent just plays a lackluster move, and we get to play a move like f4, and we get to run our pawns up the board, all the way up the board, knocking away the knight with tempo, knocking away the bishop with tempo, opening up this rook to attack, opening up this bishop, which I don't really talk about this bishop as much. This bishop is going to be redeployed on this diagonal or back here even. This bishop is going to wait a long time, and sometimes it's even sacrificed on h3 in order to create an opening of attack for the queen or for any of your rooks. So your pieces are going to start assembling on this king side, and white can get in trouble a lot. Alright guys, and here is the famous Hikaru game where he played against Boris Gelfand. It was an amazing game in the King's Indian, and this is a time in chess history when opening knowledge was becoming crucial, and people were starting to see that the King's Indian wasn't as strong as they thought it was when they looked at the computers. But when you started playing against people in actual games, it's really clear to us that the King's Indian is such a strong opening in practical terms. The computers just hate it for whatever reason. To be honest, I just think they can't understand it. It's so tactical, and it goes from such a slow, closed position opening to something that is just so explosive and violent very, very quickly. And you'll see in this game that it just looks like a normal King's Indian position where white has an advantage the whole game, and then boom, black is winning, sacrificing all their pieces, and wins the game. So, alright. Boris Gelfand is white, Hikaru is black. We're going to be on Hikaru's side. So we've got d4, knight f6, c4, g6, the moves I was showing you earlier. Knight c3, bishop g7, the King's Indian. At this time, the Grunfeld was way more popular for black. So I bet Boris Gelfand was a little bit confused when Hikaru went for the King's Indian instead of the Grunfeld. And Boris goes for e4. We get d6 in order to stop e5. Knight to f3, castles, bishop e2. This is the orthodox variation, the one I showed you earlier with bishop e2. And we go e5. And remember, Boris is not going to take because he knows about the tactic that I showed you guys earlier. We get castles, knight c6, d5, and knight to e7, the line I was showing you guys earlier. And this is a different line. So before I showed you guys the bayonet attack, which is b4 immediately, this is one of the modern systems where you go knight to d2. And the idea is you're going to want to play b4 and c5, and then you're going to jump your knight onto c4, where it's a kind of excellent piece, adding a lot of pressure. So this knight wants to get out of the way, and you also want to fortify your position with this f3 move if possible. So if you play f5 here for black, white can play f3 and sort of defend their pawn, open up the file, and that way there's equal negotiation along the file, and it's not like black gets all the fun. So Hikaru goes with this knight e8 move, which I showed you guys earlier. It isn't a very common move in the King's Indian. Knight e8 and knight h5, both very common. Also, knight h4 after you've moved your pawn is a very common idea as well. Boris goes for the idea. So he starts with b4. And Hikaru plays f5 before Boris can even strike, even before he can even strike with c5. And he gets c5 in. And knight goes right back to f6, which is nice. So the knight's redeploying. It's going to be controlling squares. And here we are making a lot of threats on this e4 pawn, which is eventually going to need to be defended. So Boris defends it with f3, and that was one of the main ideas of his move, knight to d2. And Hikaru plays pawn f4. Now, as you're seeing here, the engine says this position is great for white. White is super close to winning, but when you look at it, it's not obvious why. Yes, white has a lot of space on the queen side. Yes, white is going to have a queen side attack, but black is getting their pieces in. Black's pieces are going to start having some sort of activity very soon, and these pawns are going to keep coming. And one mistake from white, and it's over. So knight goes to c4, like I was telling you. This is the square that the knight is aiming for, creating pressure on this pawn here. And Hikaru says, I want to get all my pawns into the game. So he's got g5 going, a4, and his knight that went from c6, or went from b8 to c6, then went to e7, now redeploys to g6, so it's another piece that's going to add pressure to the king side. And an idea I was showing you guys earlier, bishop to a3, is an idea creating more pressure on this d6 pawn. D6 pawn is getting very, very much pressure, especially after this move here. There's going to be tons and tons of pressure, and white is going to be creating a lot of pressure on that pawn. Black is going to have to defend. An interesting move, rook to f7. Now, rook to f7 may look kind of mystical for you guys, but it is a rook lift in its purest form. Black is going to send up these pawns, drop back the bishop, and the rook is going to slide over to these H or G files, whichever one Hikaru chooses, and there will be another piece staring down. As you've seen here, there's not really a great pawn break to open up the F file for black, but this move here could open up the G file. This pawn move here, H5, H4, H3 could open up the H file. So Hikaru is planning on lifting his rook to one of those files. If Boris goes with B5, and Hikaru decides to take, he's saying the pressure is becoming too unbearable here in the center, and white is going to start being able to have this pawn crash through. So instead of letting the pressure build, he decides to end the pressure all at once. White takes, and Hikaru says, I'm going to attack you on the king side. So he goes with H5. And Boris says this, I'm going to attack you on the queen side, goes with A5. Hikaru keeps going, G4. Boris keeps going, B6. Hikaru keeps going, G3, sending his pawn deeper and deeper into white's territory, creating more and more space. There's a lot of tactics here, but white wants to get off of this diagonal. White also wants to get out of this file. So white also wants to avoid this move coming with check. So if he's not going to take like this and get this position here, he doesn't want black to be able to throw in this move with a check as well. So he moves over so that his king is going to be blockading the pawn. And this is actually a really nice position for white. As you can see here, the engine says this is great for white. And why is that? Well, this file has been blocked by the pawn. There's no way black can ever use this file to put a rook on and attack white, because the pawn is guarding. The pawn is kind of like a shield for white. It can't move forward because of the king's placement, and the only way it can be destroyed or gotten rid of is if white captures it. White's not going to capture it. Why would they want to? It's a perfect shield. Okay, so D6 is played, and this is where white's starting to lose a bit of their advantage. D6 is a kind of dangerous move. Starting to simplify in the center here. It's a bit premature, offering a bunch of trades. Hikaru takes on a B6 first. Bishop goes all the way back, and the knight jumps in. And there's going to be all sorts of tactics arising here, from sacrificing the knight on this square here and lifting the rook over. And this is going to be an idea that you or me or any normal chess player would not be able to see from far, far away. But Hikaru sees ideas like this in his sleep, lifting up his rook and being able to move the knight here, sacrificing it and taking like this. Boris decides to move his rook out of the way. He wants to get his bishop back here to defend this pawn here, because he's realizing, hey, this is a sacrifice spot for black. We want to cover it. And Hikaru says, I do not care. You haven't defended your pawn enough times, and I am going to sacrifice my knight, which is an amazing move. And let's see how Boris responded. Boris first took on c7, which was a bad move. And here, Hikaru realizes he can just capture the rook. And you might say to yourself, why would Hikaru give up his queen like that? Well, if you give up your queen, you actually give your opponent mate in 1 with an amazing move, g2 checkmate. Because the king is trapped right in the corner and the pawn is being defended by the knight, so you cannot take the queen. And this was an amazing foresight from Hikaru, seeing that he doesn't have to take back immediately, because normally when you play chess and your queen is threatened, you need to deal with that threat immediately. But he saw the greater idea of knight takes the rook on e1, and this was an amazing move that gave Hikaru a lovely advantage, but the theatrics don't stop there. So Boris, seeing that he could not capture the queen, decided to take the knight instead. And here Hikaru gave the check, g2, king takes, rook over to g7, and notice the queen is just still hanging all this time. King steps right back all the way to the corner again, and then Hikaru, normal chess player would just move their queen and not leave it hanging for the third move in a row. Hikaru says, no, I'm going to play bishop to h3. An amazing move, getting this bishop into the game. This bishop that so often the King's Indian sits by and waits for its opportunity, and now the opportunity has come. Bishop to h3 is an amazing move, threatening checkmate in 1 with bishop to g2, kind of similar to the pawn checkmate that we were looking at earlier. So white has to respond to that. White cannot and will not take the queen because of checkmate. So white decides to defend g2 one more time by playing the move bishop back to f1, defending the square. And Hikaru finds another amazing move in this position. I'm going to give you a second to try to find it. Don't look in the bottom right. You'll totally see it, but don't look at it. Alright, this move is amazing. Queen to d3. What an amazing move. Like, how could you even see a move like this? It looks so weird because, like, it looks like you're hanging your queen, but if your opponent takes a queen, nothing's defending g2 anymore, and there's checkmate. Not only that, but you're also threatening a lot here. If you take like this, say the opponent doesn't do anything the next move, they just move their knight. You can take with the queen here, takes like this, and you could lose the game pretty quickly in a lot of these positions. And this position is becoming worse and worse, more simplified, easier to play for black, and horrible. So white needs to find a way to respond in this kind of position. So Boris goes for knight takes c5, creating a threat on the queen. And Hikaru sees that he can leave his queen hanging because of mate. So he leaves his queen hanging, and he just takes the bishop here. Opponent takes the bishop with their queen, and then Hikaru takes this knight. And if you count the material, Hikaru has 2 minor pieces and 2 rooks. For white's 2 minor pieces and 1 rook. And Boris decided to play rook c1 here. Hikaru took the knight. And now, since you saw that before, Hikaru wins another piece. Of course, there's a promotion, so Hikaru is going to lose his piece right back. But here we've got a rook and 2 pieces versus a rook and a piece. And Boris says, there's no way I'm ever going to win this, and he resigns the game. So what was so amazing about this game is Hikaru made the unexpected move in just about every position. He left his queen hanging many, many times, and he just defied our expectations in this position. When you play d takes c7, you expect your opponent to just capture back and say, hey, thanks for threatening my queen. I got my pawn back, and now the next move. But Hikaru doesn't just make a reactionary move. Hikaru makes the best move. And here, knight to e1 was an amazing move, followed up by a series of brilliant moves. Personally, I think this bishop h3 is brilliant, and I think that this queen d3 is amazingly difficult move to find in over the board game, but Hikaru manages to do it every single time. That's why I think Hikaru is one of the greatest players. Anyways, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm going to continue to put out more opening videos like this, and just leave a comment, just letting me know what you think. Letting me know uh, any ideas you have for openings that you'd like to see. And if you did not see the latest video on the Sicilian defense, I would highly advise you to watch that video. It's a great video. I'm pretty proud of it, and I think you guys could learn a lot from it. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. See ya.